inconsistency detection. Cool. Like around summary inconsistency detection, which just very recently got accepted at Tackle. So the slides there are a little bit messier, but in any case, what I want to focus on is, this can be a discussion. So if you have some question at any point, please feel free to ask, and like we can chat. At the end, I've like kind of outlined some things that I think are pretty cool ideas and big ideas, and I'll ask you questions and I want you to kind of think about it. So yeah, feel free to like participate in any way. I'm super excited to be talking with you guys. Okay, so let's jump into the summary loop. So yeah, this is a project I did with my 2 advisors in Berkeley, as well as I was an intern in Bloomberg NLP. And so with Andrew C, who was my mentor there. Okay, so first I'll start by asking you a question about what makes a good summary. And the standard answer in NLP, is, well, summarization is a hard topic, and I don't know what's a good summary, but I can give you a million examples of article summary pairs. Like here's a CNN article, here's its summary, and then from that maybe you can train a model and it'll learn to mimic this data set, and that way we'll find out what a summarization is. What summarization is without really defining it. And if you have a lot of data, then that's extremely powerful. Like we've seen, many models are pretty impressive and can do many cool things with a lot of data. But when you don't have a lot of data, obviously it's more challenging. So what we did in the summary loop is we kind of deconstructed the problem, and we started from trying to define what a good summary is. And you'll see it has some weaknesses because it is a hard thing to do. So we had to take some stances and decide what we mean. And then we designed this definition into rewards that we directly optimize with RL, with reinforcement learning. So let's walk you through that. So the definition we came up with is that a summary is a brief, fluent text that covers the main points of an original document. So here we're talking like single document summarization, standard setting. Like we're not talking here's a collection of documents. We're keeping it kind of simple. And you've noticed I've underlined brief, fluent, and covers because these are going to be the 3 pillars of the summary loop, like the 3 main points of the method that we designed. Okay, so here's the high-level diagram, and we're going to decompose it kind of one step at a time. Okay, let's get started. So we first start with a summarizer model, which is going to be, like a GPT-2 model that is already pre-trained, and we're going to kind of start with that. And the way it's going to work is we're going to input a document, we're going to send a start token, and we're going to say, summarize, like go ahead. And at first it's going to do not really interesting stuff because it's not trained, right? It's just going to like do whatever GPT-2 does when it tries to complete a document. But the important thing is we're going to have a brevity factor. So we're only going to let the model generate up to some number of tokens, right? So if we want summaries of up to length 10, then the target length will be 10, otherwise 40, otherwise 25. So we're going to have this customizability of the length. And you guessed it, at this stage, because this model is not trained in any way, the summaries that we obtain are usually pretty garbage. Like they're not real summaries. Okay, so that's for brevity. So now let's focus on this. Covers the main points of the original document, because this is probably, you guessed it, that like the bread and butter here. Like how are we going to do that? Well, so here's the idea. The idea is we're going to take the document here at the bottom D, and we're going to mask it. We're going to remove all the keywords and entities, or at least all the ones that we think are important and that we want to be able to, we want to have that information at a high level in the summary. And then the idea is we're going to have, a coverage model that's going to, see the masked document, see the summary here on the right, and it's going to have to try to fill in the gaps. All these question marks, everything that we've removed is going to have to try to figure out, reading the summary, what is it that's missing? And as you can imagine, if the summary is completely irrelevant, then it's not going to be able to do a good job, right? But if the summary is pretty good and getting more and more informative, it's going to be able to fill in more and more. Okay, so more precisely, here's a news article about protests in Chile. And yeah, like the fact that there's protests in Chile, so the president decided to cancel 2 summits, so the APEC and the COP25 that were supposed to happen because of the protests. Okay, so here what you see in blue is, we use the unsupervised model to select keywords and entities. We extract them. So we mask it out. So this is what the mask document looks like. And then, we want to fill in the gaps, right? So like, here's what happens. I'll show you what the coverage model looks like, but here's a summary that is generated. It says like Chile will not host the APEC 2 summits to take place this year because of protests. And you can see here in green what masked words have been able to be recovered. And so basically here the coverage score would be 10 out of 15. Now imagine if the model had gone on a tangent and talked about like, penguins in Antarctica or something. You would imagine that it wouldn't be able to fill anything. It would not have the right information to achieve this kind of objective. So masking, maybe you've kind of already thought, oh, this has something to do with BERT, right? And this is not like an accident. Basically what we did is we took a BERT model and we fine-tuned it to do coverage. So the way BERT is pre-trained is through this masked language modeling procedure where 15% random sampled words are masked, and then the model has to learn to recover them. So instead of, in our case, we don't want to remove randomly sampled words. We want to remove the context words, right? We want to remove, all the words that we want the summary to convey. So that's one difference between, masked language modeling and the coverage task. And the other thing is we also condition on the summary. So we concatenate the unmasked summary with the masked document, and then we let the model try to figure out what are the masks, what is missing, right? And that way, if the model is smart, it can look, here, it can look on the left, it can peek at the summary and be like, oh yeah, this is about Chile, right? Or this is about, President Piñera. And it can try to like, bring that information into, the self-attention on the right, and then be able to predict what are the missing words. So yeah, there is this similarity between MLM and the coverage task. So, now that you kind of understand how the coverage model works at a high level, the coverage model gets the masked document, the summary, and then it tries to predict the word that's missing in each position. And then, depending on how many it gets correct, it gets a score between 0 and 1. All right, so that's great. Now we kind of have this notion that, as the summarizer is trying to score high on coverage, it's going to try to use these words in some way or the other. The problem is if you just optimize coverage, basically the summarizer GPT-2 model is pretty smart, and it learns to like sort of reverse engineer the masking procedure. And it learns, oh, like I know these are the words that are going to be masked. Like I have, I can tell you're going to mask President Piñera. And so what it does is it just does a word soup of keywords. It writes like, the summary is going to look like President Piñera protests Chile, COP25 or something like that, because it's like, well, here's all the information you need coverage model to fill in the gaps. And this is not really what we want, right? Like a summary is not a keyword soup. Like that's not really a very satisfying answer. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit? I'm not entirely clear on how you determine what are the context words that are going to be masked.
Yeah. So this is kind of context specific, but in our case, what we did is we used something like a TF-IDF measure to basically extract, in this long document, what are the things that are important, what are the repeated entities. We used an NER model to extract repeated entities, mask all of them. But this is indeed like kind of a very important detail. And to give you an example, my original masking strategy did not mask numbers because somehow, the number 2, 3, 13 and stuff like that, they don't have very high TF-IDF because, they're pretty frequent things, they happen. And so, the coverage model the masking procedure never masked numbers. So the coverage model never got penalized for not guessing those right. And so the summary would always mess up the numbers. It would be like, oh, there's 14 dead, but it was actually 12. But actually it would never get penalized for that, right? Because they weren't being masked. And so like when, we started figuring that out, I was like, it always gets the numbers wrong, right? So then we, changed the masking procedure to like always mask numbers, right? And so like this kind of shows you that like, depending on your application, if this was like a fintech summarizer, like you want to get all the numbers right? So you'd focus on that. But if it's like, something else, you might want to focus on like all the entities and getting the countries right or whatever. So this is kind of my point is like, we use something fairly simple that what made sense for the news domain. But if, you're summarizing dialogues, for instance. Maybe you want to mask all the, the speakers, right? Or you want to mask, I don't know, like the names of everybody who's mentioned or something like that. So I think this is the very adaptable thing right here, is that because we're doing this completely unsupervised without any examples, you have to kind of build what you want to happen in the summaries, and that's through the masking procedure to some extent. Great question.
Thank you.
So what happens is the summarizer becomes too good at reverse engineering what words are being masked. It does this keyword soup, and so we have what I call the referee in this process, which is like the fluency model, which is like, okay, you still have to write in English here. So this is pretty simple. It's also a language model pre-trained on a large English collection, and it has it'll read only the summary, and it'll have to decide, okay, is this fluent? Like, is this correct? Like, kind of correct English sentences. And so yeah, this part actually in this paper was pretty simple. It was just a GPT-2 model as well, just fixed and pre-trained on English. So now we get a fluency score, coverage score, and we sum it up and we get a summary score. And basically we're going to use reinforcement learning, a very standard technique called self-critical sequence training, to optimize the summary score. Okay. So basically what happens is two things happen. The first thing that happens is, you can see when you train it, in the first 10% of training, the fluency and coverage shoot up. And what happens is the model first learns to copy. It learns that, oh, wow, I can just like copy the first 3 sentences, and that does good in coverage, and that does good in fluency. And like, that's actually great. This is what we call in summarization, we call this the lead 3 bias. It's like, if you choose the first 3 sentences in a summarization data set, usually it's a really strong baseline to beat. So like, the fact that the RL figures out the baseline on its own is kind of a good sign. And then after that, apart from this peak that happens in this graph, I want you to notice that fluency basically stays stable, whereas coverage goes up very slowly, and the summary score, which is the sum, goes up very slowly. And what's happening there is the model is slowly learning to condense information. So in the same amount of text, it's able to increase its coverage very slowly while remaining fluent. So basically it's learning to fuse sentences together without getting penalized on fluency. It's learning to simplify entities from like President Barack Obama to just saying Obama. It's learning all these tricks. And the cool thing here is there's no data, right? It's learning all of this through a coverage and a fluency score, right? Yeah, and this is like, so here the summarizer was a GPT-2 base. We trained on the Titan X. This is a while ago, and we could do much better today if we were to implement this. Okay, and then I've been talking about fluency and coverage a lot, but I want you to remember brevity at the start was also an important parameter, where we had this target length, and we forced the summarizer not to write beyond a certain point. And this actually has a big effect. So here's 3 different models trained with different target lengths. And you can see basically what happens that's cool, that I was super excited about back then, is as you increase the target length, so from 10 to 24, the model is still able to generate just 1 sentence, and usually most of the time get away with that, even though it puts more detail in the sentence. But when you go to 45, the model figures out, I'm actually better off writing multiple shorter sentences rather than one 45-word long sentence. And this is all like data, like it learns that through the process of like, well, when I write 45 long word sentences, I get penalized by the fluency. So it's kind of like all learned through reinforcement learning signal, which is just pretty cool. Okay, so of course summarization paper means Rouge results. So I'm not going to go too much in detail on this, but we were able to show that we get pretty close to supervised methods, even though, but we beat all the unsupervised methods by a long shot. So that was kind of cool. Yeah, I'm not going to go more in detail on this. It's kind of expected. Like, we're not able to beat, like a big neural net that's trained on millions of examples with this unsupervised RL, which we'll see is a bit different in the simplification world. Okay, and then the second thing we did in this paper is we manually annotated examples. Because we were interested in seeing, what did the summarizer learn, right? Without seeing any examples, did it learn to use summarization techniques like sentence merging, sentence compression, entity simplification, and things like that. So we did an analysis of two other models, like previous model, pointer generator and bottom-up, as well as summary loop. We annotated how often they were inconsistent, how often they were ungrammatical, and then how often did they use summarization techniques. And we had four techniques that we kind of targeted. And what we found is obviously not so rosy, that most models are pretty inconsistent. You can see actually the pointer generator model, which is the oldest model, is less inconsistent, and that's a good thing. And that's because it's very extractive. So you can see that it actually is the one that uses the least summarization techniques. And this kind of points to the fact that, like, today in summarization, you can either be consistent and extractive and not take many risks, or you can be very abstractive and most likely fail and be inconsistent, right? And we'll get back to this. This is what the third project is all about. But bottom line, the kind of silver lining is this number at the bottom right, the 57%, which shows that our model used a lot more techniques that it learned on its own. And overall, it was more successful at applying it, which means it was more successful at trying to merge sentences without causing an inconsistency or like something ungrammatical. So that was kind of exciting. But at the end of the day, 1 in 4 summaries was inconsistent, and like that's still a problem. So the paper ends with like, all right, there's still a lot to do, and like, this is not like the end all for all of summarization. All right, so this is the first part. I'm a little bit behind on time, but if you guys have questions, feel free to ask before I move on to simplification. Yeah. For now, I'll move on, and then, oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, just one question. I'm curious, I don't know if this happens frequently with summarization, but it's true that the model has like has to do exactly like 45 words or 25 words or whatever you specify, right? It doesn't have any wiggle room.
No, you can. So basically, the current summarization data sets, like say CNN Daily Mail, if you compute the statistics, average 46 words, right? But obviously, humans, when they write, they don't write exactly 46 words. So what happens is people, well, when you train with supervision, you don't really have a target length. You just, train a model, and lo and behold, on average, it generates summaries that are 46 words on average, because, it's learning to mimic whatever is in the data set. And people have shown that if you increase the length beyond, or like if you pick summaries that are longer or shorter, because you use beam search and you get several candidates, if you deviate from that average statistics, your rouge scores will go down. This has been shown. So basically, it's kind of like this unfortunate fact. And this is why when we did our evaluation, we trained the model that had a target length of 24. There's a data set called Newsroom that has this average target length. And we trained the model that had an average target length of 45, because that's the CNN Daily Mail target, right? But we could have done 30, we could have done 40. And you're right, the model doesn't always use this length. I think so there is, in some of my presentation, I'm sorry, there's a fourth diagram which shows you that the model here has a target length of 10 words, and it starts around 8.5, and it learns slowly to get closer and closer. So it kind of greedily tries to use the budget that you give it, which is, I think, pretty cool, and kind of a different way of thinking about it. Yeah, no, good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, keep it simple. So first, I'll talk about text simplification, because it's less like known of a task than summarization, and then I'll tell you why I was excited about this subject. So in text simplification, I call it the sister task to summarization, but the idea here is we want to keep all the information. We don't want to lose any, we're not doing content selection like in summarization, but we want to lower the readability level. So we want to make it more accessible to, younger people, or people who are English as a second language or whatever. So the idea is two things. You want to lower the lexical difficulty, so using simpler words. So you can see here, this is a simplification by a journalist from a group called Newsella, where they took a news article about some rat saving lives by clearing landmines, and they lowered it. And you can see here, I've highlighted the red words that are in the original that aren't in the simplified versions. And you can see the green words are much simpler words. So that's lexical simplification, but there's also syntactic simplification, which is you want to take complicated sentences that have several verbs and several clauses, and you want to kind of simplify syntactically the sentence so that it's easier to process. basically. And you can see here in the second version, there's a lot more sentences. Like this has 2 sentences, this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sentences, and they're all short. So that's text simplification, and it's super useful in the education domain. It's useful all over the place. Okay, so here's why this is a great area to get into for unsupervised text generation. So in summarization is supervised land. Like there is many data sets, they're multi-million article long, they're mostly clean, they've been studied for like 5-6 years. So simplification is a bit younger, and there's 2 main data sets. There's one data set called Simple Wikipedia, and it's, it was used a lot, and then one paper came out and was like, this is a terrible data set. And they did some really cool analysis showing why there was limitations to this data set, and it's very noisy. They showed, for instance, that in 20% of the instances, the simplified version is actually more complex on some metrics than the original. So it's like it was kind of mind-blowing to the community, or at least to me. And then there's Newsela, which I already kind of showed you an example from, which is this very curated data set, super high quality, but pretty small. And so, supervised models are only going to get you so far with 2,000 examples, essentially. So it was like, oh, cool, a problem that we could potentially approach with unsupervised learning that maybe we'll be able to beat the supervised baselines because they can't get that far in simplification. Okay, so long story short, we took summary loop and we kept the fluency. We took coverage, we modified it, and this is where your comment was good. Like, we don't want to now mask just keywords, right? We want to mask most content words. So we modified the masking strategy, and we called it salience because one of the authors didn't like the word coverage. But more or less, coverage is about, like, salience is about the same as coverage, except we modified the masking strategy for simplification. Fluency is about the same. We made it a bit more robust than in summary loop because I had more time and we tried some fancier things. But the main thing that changed is we added the simplicity. The guardrails I won't talk about, they're kind of a detail, and we had them in the summary loop as well. They just weren't in the diagram. So let me kind of show you how we came up with the simplicity measures. So just like I talked about in the intro, we have 2 simplicity measures. One is syntactic simplicity, and one will be lexical simplicity. So for syntactic simplicity, we did a great recycling, and we used something called the Flesch-Kincaid grade level, which is this super old metric from, like, you can see here, the site is from 1949, which is like these education researchers, they came up with these basic metrics to basically take text and measure what they think the grade level, the accessibility grade level for that text is. And it's based on basically the number of words per sentence and the number of syllables per words. So it's super easy to compute. It's not a neural network or anything. And it works pretty well. And the idea is, what we'll want to do is, you give me a text, I measure its FKGL. It's like, okay, 9.5. Here, the original example I showed you is 9.5. And what we'll do is we'll want the model to decrease it by at least some amount, maybe 3 grade levels, 4 grade levels, whatever. We can set that. And the idea is, the score is going to be between 0 and 1 of like, how far did you get towards the target? Like something very simple. So that's syntactic simplicity. Lexical simplicity, we had to handcraft a little bit more. And the idea is, it's more about the words. It's not about the sentences. And so in the rewrite, we create 2 sets of words, the words that are removed and the words that are added. And the idea is we want the words that are added to be simpler words than the words that are removed, right? Like that's kind of the idea. So except simpler is hard to define. There's many, many measures of word simplicity, like age of acquisition, and there's many things. We went for something pretty simple, which is basically there's this huge collection by Google of word frequency on the whole internet. And it's pretty supposedly well correlated with, word frequency on the internet tells you how frequent a word is, in many contexts, which tells you how simple it is, right? So the idea is we took that, and somebody has done some really interesting research around how do you normalize that into a score. And so we piggybacked on that. And basically you can see here, the 4 words that were removed in the example I showed you, this is their frequency. So lower means less frequent, means harder, right? And you can see landmines is a pretty uncommon word, right? And numerous, potentially, they're 4 to between 2 and 4. Whereas like the words that are added in the example, like very, possibly, many things, they're all like between 5 and 6. And so the idea is similar. We basically average the frequencies on the left, average the frequencies on the right. And what we want is we want an increase in that. So we have some target increase of say 0.5 frequency or something like that. And then we build a ramp. So we like, as the model gets closer to an increase in frequency, it gets a higher score in lexical simplicity. So that's the idea. We sum the two of those, lexical simplicity and syntactic simplicity, and you obtain a simplicity score. So the other cool thing here, and I don't know if anybody's doing RL training here, but this, I think, was one of the biggest discoveries of this project was we were using self-critical sequence training. I mentioned it for summary loop, and we found a better way to do it, which I think is very practical and simple to do. So to kind of give you a recap for what the standard SCST is the following. You have your generator, be it the summarizer, the simplifier, or whatever. You generate two candidates, one by doing argmax, one by doing sampling. And then basically, you get two summaries, and they're usually different because sampling took a different route than the argmax. Compute the scores for both. And ideally, the scores are different. Maybe sampling did a little bit better or it did a little bit worse. And what this equation says here is pretty simple. It says, encourage the one that scored the highest. So if the sampling scored higher, you want to increase the likelihood of that. If the argmax did better, then what you do is you lower the likelihood of the sampling, which relatively is equivalent to increasing the likelihood of the argmax. And it's been shown to work really well. For instance, in image, they started using it in image captioning, but in summarization, in many text generation things, SCST is kind of a standard. Okay, the problem that happens is that what if the rewards are very close together? So what if my argmax and my sample, they end up the two summaries look very similar, and they score really, really close to each other. Then this difference here is close to 0, which means your whole loss is close to 0, which means there's no training. And what we found is that around 30 to 40% of the time during training, you'd have this problem. This problem would happen in summarization and in simplification, where you wouldn't learn anything from these samples, which slows down training a lot because you're not learning from many samples during your training. So the KSCST modification, so we added a K in front of it, where we made it a bit different, is instead of generating 2 candidates, generate more. So generate 6 or 8 candidates, something like that. And then use all the candidates to compute the mean. So that will be your new baseline, is the mean. And then what you want to do is you want to encourage all the candidates that scored higher than the mean, and you want to discourage all the candidates that lower than the mean. So it's very, very similar in flavor, except that as you increase K, as you imagine, the likelihood that they will all be the same decreases, right? Like it's very unlikely your generator is going to generate 8 times the same thing. It can happen, but we show that it goes close to 0, basically. And to kind of show you, we trained the exact same configuration of Keep It Simple with SCST, 4 SCST, 6 SCST, and 8 SCST. And you can see, the reward kind of gradually goes up faster. And from experience, what I found is that it's smoother also, the training. Like you have less bumps and you have less, difficulty training. It's still RL, it's still hard to train, but it kind of helped increase stability. So yeah, if anybody's doing RL training, I recommend at least trying this. It's been kind of a game changer for me in several of my projects. Okay, now I want to talk about my favorite part of this Keep It Simple project, which is evaluation. So first part is we had to do automatic results because that's kind of the way the research is done. And the equivalent of Rouge for simplification is SARI. So we calculated SARI scores. It's also an n-graph overlap type metric. And what we found, which was super cool, was that Keep It Simple, which is unsupervised, beat all the other supervised baselines, including Access, which is like this big FAIR paper about simplification, which was very, very recent. And I was very worried we wouldn't beat them, but we did. So that was good. And then the second thing is we measured this Lexile measure, which is a little bit like FKGL that I mentioned, but it's more complicated and it's more of a gold standard. It's what the Newsella journalists use. So like they basically rewrite until their Lexile score drops to some target amount. And so we manually basically did an inspection, and the reference Newsela rewrites, they decreased Lexile score 80% of the time. And we got pretty close, 72% of the time, whereas the other models did worse. So we were pretty happy with the automatic results. But the focus of the evaluation for us was trying to figure out how to do human evaluation for simplification. And this is a topic that I'm going to talk about again at the end, that I'm super excited about. Is text generation is just a very creative and messy process, and we need better ways to evaluate it. And so this was like us throwing a first stone at it. In no way is it perfect, but like I want to kind of like emphasize that I think this is a super cool area to work in. So, how, I have a text generator, I have a simplifier that I think is really good. How do I verify that it's, that it's better, or that that it serves a purpose essentially? So we had two hypotheses. The first one is what I call increasing accessibility, which is, imagine you have 1,000 or 10,000 people, and can you measure that the original text only 50% of the people could understand it, and the simplified text maybe 70% of the people can understand it. So can you increase accessibility of text? And this is really hard to do because, one, we're academic researchers and we don't have infinite money, and you'd have to have a large and diverse population, and like this would be super cool to do, but it's like more something that they would do in an education research setting, and not necessarily in CS. And it was very challenging to think about this. So the second one is what I call decreased cognitive load, which is take a person, take many people, but fewer than in the first one, and have them do a task with this text, and with the simplified version of the text, are they faster and is it easier for them to do their task than with the original text? So basically, let me walk you through more specifically what that means. Imagine I have a short news article, like think around 200 words, so pretty short. And then we generate comprehension questions, multiple choice. And the idea is we want people to read this text and then answer these correctly. Like something like an SAT exam, like reading comprehension type thing. Then we have, so in our case, we tested 4 systems. So we had the Newsela simplification, which is like the one from a journalist, it's human written. And then we had 3 system simplifications. So access, fine tune, and then keep it simple. Fine tune is just whatever supervised data there is from Newsela, we fine-tuned the model on that, like a BART or a GPT-2 medium, I don't remember. And then access is this Facebook paper that had the previous state of the art. Okay, so here's the setting. Then basically somebody will get randomly assigned to one of these 5, and then they'll have to. The important thing here is they'll have to resubmit the questionnaire until they get it right. So if they get an answer wrong, then it'll say, it'll turn red, and then they'll have to like change their answer. And the reason for this is we did this on MTurk, and as you can imagine, if you don't enforce that they get it right, then people will just click on random things and move on, and we won't be able to measure anything. So we found that in order to kind of align the MTurk workers' desire to finish early, but our incentive that they have to read it and understand it, we said, okay, like they have to get it right. So like if they try to brute force them, it'll take them longer than actually doing the task properly, and then that kind of aligns the incentives. And then what we measured is how long did it take and how many times did they have to resubmit. And the idea is hopefully simplified text leads you to do the task easier, right? Like to have an easier time doing this task. And yeah, we pretty much confirmed that. So this is how long it took. The average, we had about 90 participants, I forgot to mention, and each participant participated in roughly 4 documents. So, we had 4 different documents with each 5 versions. So we had about 250 submissions total. And on average across the tasks, here's how much time it would take to complete the task. Obviously it varied by document, but this is just an average. And then we found statistical significance in some of the drops, but in 3 of the systems, there was a drop. Surprisingly, in the access, there was no drop. And our hypothesis is because there is fluency problems in the access. So I think there's kind of a slowdown because some of the sentences don't connect well. But apart from that, the Newsela references, the fine tune and keep it simple led to a drop. And surprisingly, keep it simple led to the highest drop. Now, this doesn't mean that these simplifications are better than the Newsela references. It just means that they cut a little bit more things. We have an extended analysis that's not in this talk where actually, if you take into account the compression rate, Newsela references achieve the best score. So just something to keep in mind. But basically, this potentially is a good way to evaluate text simplification. Okay, so that's what I wanted to talk about. Keep it simple. Do you guys have any questions, or should I move on to the next one?
I have a question, Philippe.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, so both of the simplification and summarization, you decompose the task into different aspects, like coverage or fluency, whatever. And then you optimize the model to get better scores with respect to this scores you design, right?
Yeah.
So, and your unsupervised model is performing well. Is this because of you decompose the problems into the sub aspects that are required to do the task well, or is it because you're learning some additional knowledge from the pre-trained model like a GPT-2 or BERT?
Yeah, no, I think you have a great point. So one, I think the decomposition is a nice feature because it helps with debuggability. So like, for instance, like the thing with the numbers that I mentioned, like if you had just one big reward, it would be impossible to figure out, what's happening. So I think being able to decompose things makes it very easy to debug and able to understand what's happening and how to improve it. Like I spent like 4 or 5 months designing these simplicity measures. Like it started very different, and like over time you figure out how to do it. But I think you're totally right that this would not be possible if these generators weren't pre-trained LMs, because like the whole way they learn is because they're strong LMs and they can go off track. And sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes when they go off track, they do compress something and it's like, oh, this increased coverage by some amount, right? So if they're not good, like if you start this with a GPT-2 that's not pre-trained and it's just writing gibberish, like literally like random symbols, you're never going to learn a summarizer, right? Like it's never going to happen. So I think you're very much right that like this relies on the fact that there's inner knowledge in this generator, that it knows how to generate sentences. And in there somewhere on the internet, it's seen compressed sentences, it's seen merged sentences, it's seen a lot of text. And it's just a matter of it learning to map to it essentially through these rewards. So yeah, I think for me, like when I started working on this subject, GPT-2 had kind of just come out and we were like, oh, what would it, and they have in the GPT-2 paper, they have this 0-shot summarization experiment where they take a text, they say TLDR, and then they show, they let the model generate and they see what happens. And this is where it all started. We were like, what could we do to take this to the next step? Because like the results were pretty mediocre. Like we have it in the paper, they do really, really terrible. And it was like, okay, what can we do to take it to the next step? Like 0-shot, it's not great, but probably this model can self-train itself, right? And that's what we kind of went after. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I just have one quick follow-up here, Chris. So,
yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so maybe as a NLP researcher, let's say I just entered the graduate school, and I like to learn about NLP, but then do you think collecting more data sets to the task and collect the data set from crowd workers, and then we have this pretty much like a label data set, and then train the model, typical model, and then get some performance? Or do you think a smart researcher like you just come up with some aspect, the core aspects that makes the problem solved, and then what's those aspects, and then design them properly, and then optimize them, and maybe then we don't need extra annotation from crowd workers. So which way might be more appealing? Yeah. Of course, you might be the latter one, but I just wonder, how do you envision unsupervised methods, or how do you think about the supervised labeled data set, and then what's the role of NLP researcher in general?
No, yeah, I think you make a great point. I think when I started doing this, when I started the summary loop, my advisors were like, oh, why are you doing TF-IDF? It's so dirty, and why are you so crafting these so complicated, And it kind of reminds me of like, how computer vision was like before, like, CNNs and all of that. It was like a lot of handcrafted things, right? And like people thought that's the future, right? So I think like, I think I'm kind of like backwards, right? Like the birds have happened, like all the end-to-end pre-training, all of that has happened. And I'm like on top of that, adding my feature engineering and my like handcrafted designs. And so in some ways, I think like it's kind of waves, like you do one, then you do the other, and you eventually somebody will figure out a better way to do it than me, which won't require as much feature engineering. But I think like to your point, if we just do data-centric NLP, like it only gets us so far, I think. And actually there's a section in the summary loop paper, which is called Supervision is Not the Enemy, which basically goes after like, but in some cases you do have some data, right? So why wouldn't you use it? Like why get stuck in this unsupervised setting? And so what we do is we take a GPT-2, we train it with all of CNN Daily Mail, and then we take GPT-2, we train it with 10% of CNN Daily Mail. Obviously the performance drops, standard supervision. And then we take the summary loop, we train it with 100% and 10%, and we get much better rouge scores. So with 10% of CNN Daily Mail, we get the same performance that GPT-2 had with all of CNN Daily Mail. So it kind of shows you that maybe the two are married, right? Like you find some, if you think of the summary loop as a pre-training task in itself, specific to summarization, and then you have some data, maybe you can go much further with that data once you've pre-trained on the task. So maybe the answer is you need both. I think, data-centric stuff has, super powered us. Like, I mean, it's really insane. Like I was looking today at Salesforce, we have dialogue summarization on Slack conversations. And it's like, you can ask a query and it'll find it in the conversation. It's like, that would be hard to do in the summary loop mode. Like, yeah, collecting a data set for this at least helps like, just like get to the first step. And then maybe you can improve it from there with RL, right? So I think it's kind of a complicated story. I think if you want to do something in NLP, you shouldn't have to collect 1 million samples though, right? Like that's very cost prohibitive. So if we can do stuff to reduce that to it, and this has become the hottest topic in NLP, like few shot and zero shot things, right? So, and I think that's where the handcrafting and being smart about designing the models comes into place. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You had a question? Sorry, I can't see your name. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted.
First, Libby. I saw it.
Let me just say that I love how you're exploiting mTurk to both get an important metric and make people actually complete the task. I think that's really cool.
Yeah.
My question is, I think it's on the previous slide where you're this one, where you're looking at the replacement of words based on the simplicity. I noticed there's not really, it seems you're losing some possibly important meaning with some of these replacements. How do you balance those? Like, have you thought about that as a separate problem, just balancing the loss of meaning versus the simplicity in the text?
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. And I think hopefully if you have a good coverage model, then it should pick up some of that. Like your coverage score should go down when you simplify too much of the meaning away. So for instance, here, landmines is not mentioned anymore in this simplification. And this is like simplified by a journalist. So the journalist chose not to use the word landmine. But obviously this is about a rat helping remove landmines. So if you lose that word, you lose something, right? And so I think that there's kind of this difficult choice to make in simplification. One thing that they do in Newsela, which we don't do yet very well in simplification, and Keep It Simple doesn't really do it either, is they'll add another sentence. If they add a difficult word like landmine, they'll then generate an explanation sentence. A landmine is, whatever, a weapon, blah, blah, blah. Or like they'll have like kind of a dictionary type definition that is tagged along. And there's actually a cool, I think, workshop paper in the last 6 months, I don't remember where, that focuses on these explanation sentences and deciding what word needs to have an explanation and how do you integrate it and all that. And I think that's super cool, like tangential addition to simplification. I think, yeah, like simplification is a much smaller domain than summarization, mostly because of this data, right? Like data was there, so summarization just boomed. But I think simplification is a much, much more useful thing. I keep seeing papers in education, and I was having this discussion with this professor in econ at Harvard who's like, I am studying the lexical simplicity of the New York Times versus Fox News to try to determine in political science if like this has an effect on, the readership of these newspapers, and like it's like super cool area where there's a lot of social science work going around. I don't think summarization has a lot of social science as much, at least, or that I know of. So yeah, I am personally a big advocate of this area, because you can evaluate it end to end. Like this is one of the questions I asked at the very end. How do you evaluate end to end in this task-based way summarization? It's very challenging because it's hard to know what in a particular setting what summarization is for. So yeah, I think, sorry, I went on a tangent a little bit to your question, but I think that's the, like what you're describing, the problem that you're describing is part of the reason why simplification is super cool.
Yeah, thank you. The clarification struck me as a really cool subproblem.
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you look up clarification sentences or definition sentences in simplification, you'll find the paper. Okay, so this is now the third part of the talk. Sorry, I'm running a bit late, but that's okay. And it's a paper that, I mean, Dongyot doesn't know. This paper got really recently accepted to tackle, and he helped shape it over the summer and in the late spring. So yeah, I'm super pumped about it. And yeah, sorry, Keep It Simple was a collaboration with Microsoft Research as well, and so this is also a collaboration with them. It's also a follow-up to Keep It Simple. So I want to just go back to the slide that we had in Summary Loop, which said, most of these summarizers are inconsistent. And like this is not news. Everybody knows about it, and it's become like kind of one of the hottest topics in summarization. Is, well, these summarizers are fluent. They write these beautiful sentences that nobody can distinguish from real human written sentences. They usually are relevant. They cover the right points. They have the right keywords. But sometimes they get the facts wrong, right? They will flip who the murderer is with who the victim is. They'll get the number of victims wrong. They'll say the wrong country, things like that, which like basically means that it's completely unusable in practice, right? Because like if you don't get factuality right, then you can't really use it. Like it doesn't matter that it's fluent. So a lot of focus has been on this area, and we kind of added our stone. We kind of threw our own stone to it. Which is basically, I'll read you the title of the paper. It's Revisiting NLI-based Methods for Inconsistency Detection and Summarization. So basically, the kind of basic idea is, some of you might know about NLI. So I'll first, give you an example. So this is a document and a summary on the left and on the right, where basically it's about Mars like being studied by scientists, and they found a strange area of Mars. This is a recent news article. And then in the summary, the model says, this makes Arcadia plus Nitya, which is that area, ideal for future missions. And actually, this is not said in the document, and it's kind of invented. And like basically the question is, how do you detect this inconsistency? How can you detect it, remove it from the summarizing? So the basic idea, what if we use NLI models? So NLI, just very quick intro to NLI, is it's a three-way classification task. You're given a hypothesis, a premise here, like 3 kids are playing soccer in the backyard. And then you have 3 hypotheses or three labels, either entailment, which means, yes, this is like, it's valid, like these 2 things go together and they imply each other. Neutral, and then contradiction. So here, like the examples I gave is, some children are running after a ball, that's entailed. Neutral is it's sunny outside, because we don't really know if it's sunny outside, nothing is said about that. So it could be, it could not be. And then contradiction, children never play soccer. Well, obviously that's wrong, because some children are playing soccer. So the kind of idea is, well, what if I go back to my example here? What if the summary here kind of contradicts the document, or at least some of the pieces in the summary aren't entailed by the document, right? Like maybe we can use NLI for summary consistency detection. So good news is, we're not the first people to think about this. Several people have tried it, but they kind of showed that it doesn't work. And to give you an example here, if you take this document and the summary, you make the document the premise, you make the summary the hypothesis, feed that to an NLI model, one of the top NLI models, it'll say with 91% confidence that this is an entailment. So not great. But so what went wrong? Our theory was that what went wrong is that NLI models are trained with sentence level. So, the premise is always a sentence, the hypothesis is always a sentence. So it's very fine grained. Whereas inconsistency detection, you want to do it at the document level. So the document might have 40 sentences, the summary might have 5 sentences. And so there's this whole like, how will an NLI model learn on its own to generalize to the document level? How can it learn to extrapolate, right? And to give you an example here, if you break it down to sentences, the document sentences and the summary sentences, and you run every single document summary sentence pair through the NLI model, what the model notices is that this S3, this third sentence summary, isn't entailed by any of the document sentences. So the NLI model is actually pretty good at saying, hey, this S3 sentence is weird. It's just that if you feed it all together, this model is confused and it thinks, well, S1 is backed up by D2 and S2 is backed up by D3. So overall pretty good, right? And it gets confused. So the idea is, what if we break it down and we use the NLI model at the sentence level instead? So we came up with two models. I'm not going to go into super detail, but basically, you have M sentences that are document sentences, N sentences that are summary sentences. Build an N by N matrix, and in each entry, you put the entailment score of the NLI model for that document summary sentence pair, right? And you get this matrix. And then from this matrix, what you do is basically we take the max over the columns, which means basically we take the maximum evidence for any summary sentence, right? We basically look for, the highest evidence. So in this example, it was, this edge and this edge. And then we average it out across summary sentences and we get a single score. So this is called zero shot because we take a pre-existing NLI data set. We don't fine tune it. We just take a max and a mean, which doesn't have any parameters. So it's completely zero shot. Okay. And then the second model is a little bit more complicated and it's called the conv model. And what we do here is we take the same histogram, the same matrix N by N, but instead of taking a max, which removes a lot of the information, we're going to take we're going to basically build a little histogram of all the values in each column, and we're going to have a fixed size distribution, which is going to tell us, whether a document is, has one thing that entails it or 3 things or 5 things, right? So we're going to be able to tell the whole distribution. And then we're going to use a 1D convolution here that's trained, that's going to be basically looking at these histograms and deciding okay, is this summary sentence valid or not valid? And we average it out. I'm sorry, I'm going a bit fast on this, but it's kind of not the most important part here. So how did we evaluate? So here we didn't do any human evaluation, but what we did is because I told you this is a really hot topic, basically there were already 6 data sets out there that had already been annotated. And so what we did is we compiled all of them. And this being a research area, people have done very different things. So some people annotated summaries from CNN Daily Mail, some people annotated XSum summaries, some people annotated both. So this is this column, the SRC column. Some people had 3 summarizers that they tested. Some people had 10, some people had 20. And so basically there's a very large diversity of content in these different data sets. And the idea is if you can do good on all of them, then this is very powerful instead of being able to do good in only one setting of inconsistency detection. So we kind of created this benchmark, which we call the SUMAC benchmark. SUMAC is for summary consistency. So we have this large benchmark. And then to give you some context, this is a binary classification task and it's balanced, or we balance the accuracy. And if you do NLI at the doc level, so this is if you just feed the whole document as a premise and the whole summary as a hypothesis, you get 56.8%, which is slightly above chance. And before SUMAC, the best results was this QuestEval paper from Facebook, where basically what they do is they take the summaries, they generate questions, and then they answer the questions with the summary and the document, and they see if the answers are the same. So something that involves generating questions, answering the questions, and then doing a mix and match, which is really slow, but kind of powerful because it uses a QG and a QA model. And they did pretty good at the task. And basically people have been thinking that NLI is not good, but QAG is the way to do summary consistency. Except we show that NLI, if you do it at the right granularity, it works better. So you see here, the zero shot model gets you pretty far. And then this conv layer addition thing where you look at the whole distribution instead of taking a max, it buys you another couple of percentage points. So yeah, so this is what we kind of, it was very surprising for us because we kind of like were following that, oh, maybe we need to use a QAG model, maybe that'll work better. And in the end, actually, it's not necessarily the case. And the reason for this, people weren't wrong back then. It's just that NLI has come a very long way. So what we did here is we tried, we swap out the NLI model and we use like basically models from the last 4 years. So we use decomposable attention, which is a pre-BERT model, if you can even imagine this. And it was, state of the art on SNLI, big paper. At the time, I was super impressed by the result. And you can see this 56.4 score. And this is a SUMAC model. So it's just that the NLI scores are not very good and not very informative. And as as the time goes by, and as you use BERT base and then BERT large, and as you go from SNLI to using MNLI, which is a better data set for NLI, and then as you add vitamin C, which is a very recent addition from, I think, in the last 6 months, you see the results just keep gradually going up. And this is super exciting, right? It means that as NLI gets better, summary consistency detection gets better, which is, I think, super exciting. And this is where like this part of the project isn't about text generation, but it's still unsupervised. It's like, how can we reuse something else to our advantage in another task? And I think this is what is like the flavor of the kind of research I do. So yeah, so this is what SUMAC is about, and hopefully it'll come out. And I think I don't have much time, but I do want to do the quick takeaways. One, with some creativity, text generation tasks can be approached in a non-supervised way. And so here's what I want you to think about. Pick another task that's a text generation task. How would you figure out how to do it in a non-supervised way? So for instance, take paragraph. Sorry, I meant paraphrase generation. I don't know what I wrote. So think of paraphrase generation. How would you modify summary? What would you do? What would be the elements that you would change? What would you keep similar, etc. Evaluation of text generation is challenging. And I bolded that because it's really challenging. And for me, it seems like task-oriented human evaluation, where, you put a human in a setting where they have to do something, you give them the NLG, and maybe they're better at the task with the NLG. That seems to me like a good answer. It seems pretty end-to-end and pretty satisfying. At the end of the day, you can be like, yeah, you're faster, or you're better, or you achieve higher accuracy, or whatever it is. So yeah, the question is, how would you do it for summarization? How would you do it for question generation? I have a project in evaluating question generation right now, which is kind of like looking at similar things. And then 3, yeah, text generation is still young right now, and it's like a very good time to get into it. And right now, at least, most models are either extractive and they play it safe. Even though they can be abstractive, they're not really, and they're consistent but extractive. And then in other cases, when they are abstractive, they're usually inconsistent. So what can we do to make models that are both abstractive and consistent? Like, how can we kind of merge these two things? I'll give you one idea. What if I take the SUMAC model, I turned it into a reward, and I added to keep it simple? What happens? Do I get a simplifier that's all of a sudden, abstractive and consistent? So what happens is, I've ran the experiments a few weeks ago. The model is super consistent because it wants that high SUMAC score, but it becomes very extractive and boring. So it like barely switches a few words out. And, it's basically that threshold. You can either be extractive and consistent or abstractive and inconsistent. So what can we do to do both together? So yeah, that's something I think is definitely, I put this picture because I think it's like the Wild West of text generation. How can we get there? All right, so that's what I had prepared. So yeah, I'd love to talk more. Oh, I want to mention, Salesforce is a great place for NLP. And so if you want to come intern, or if you're interested in a position or whatever it is, I'm not like, honestly, they didn't tell me to say it, but I want to say it. Like, if you're interested in internship, please contact us. I think my boss said they recently opened the applications or whatever. So yeah, please feel free to reach out. Okay, now I'll take questions if you guys have any.
So let's give a big applause for the speaker first. And it was amazing talk. Thank you so much, Philippe. And if you're considering interning, Philippe must be the best mentor ever. So please contact him. And
Yeah.
I'm gonna let students to start discussion, and then I'm gonna leave. So you guys can just have a free discussion from now on, okay? So maybe Deb, could you mind leading the discussion?
Hi, my name is Deb.
Yeah.
I'm one of DK's students. I'm just going to be the coordinator for this session.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah. And Donghyuk, see you around.
See you around. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.